Hello, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon keynote for today's symposium. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch break. Perhaps you were able to bring your lunch to one of the session 3 presentations, 4 great topics. Some of those will be recorded. Some of the resources that were shared will be posted on the platform for you thereafter to go visit in about a week's time. All of these sessions that will be recorded will be posted there for everybody to view. So for today's, this afternoon's plenary, we're going to follow the same format that we did with Professor Martine Pellerin, as moderated by our Vice Provost Aline Germain-Rutherford this morning. We're going to have Sean Michael Morris present for 20 minutes, our wonderful guest. We're going to then open the floor for some moderated discussion. Sean may have an opportunity to come back and synthesize some of the ideas, and we'll open the floor for the remaining time that we have. A reminder, if you're comfortable, as people are doing, you're welcome to open your cameras, give it a spirit of interactivity and participation. We love to see everybody's faces if that works for you. Also a reminder that the session is recorded. It will be posted about a week from now. You're welcome to come back and view that on the platform itself, along with the visuals that Sean will share today. Également, un rappel que nous avons une interprétation simultanée en cliquant sur le globe en bas de votre fenêtre. Donc, ici, peut-être. I don't know if I'm pointing in the right space, but there should be a globe, a sphere there, and it will allow you to select the language of your choice. And today's specialty is English and French. I think the languages are selected at random, so I'm glad that they selected the 2 official languages of the institution today. So be sure to check that out. And now allow me to introduce today's, or I should say this afternoon's speaker. We're so pleased to have Sean Michael Morris with us. He is Senior Instructor of Learning, Design, and Technology in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Colorado at Denver. He is also the Director of Digital Pedagogy Lab, an international professional development gathering for educators committed to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, critical digital pedagogy, and imagining a new future for education. He co-authored An Urgency of Teachers, the Work of Critical Digital Pedagogy, co-edited Critical Digital Pedagogy, a collection, and has contributed to many other scholarly papers, texts, and books in the area of digital pedagogy. His work has been featured by The Guardian, National Public Radio, The Economist, Izvestia, The Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, along with other publications and numerous podcasts. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Jovan. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. For those of you in the audience, we had a little bit of a scare this weekend. There was a really good chance I wasn't going to have internet today. And so it's actually really nice to be able to see everybody and to be seen. I was going to have to phone this in a very literal sense. All right, let me just share my slides real quick. Okay. So last Friday night, I was watching RuPaul's Drag Race UK. The Drag Race franchise is one way that all my family has marked the seasons for quite a few years now. There's an original Drag Race, the All-Stars competition, and now the UK and Canada editions. And we usually treat ourselves to takeout, and then we sit and cheer and dish and laugh for the hour while we watch. But last Friday, at the end of the episode, the cast were called to a wall-mounted TV screen where they usually are given coy instructions for the next challenge of the day. Except this time, RuPaul, as glamorous as ever in her wig and makeup, announced that due to the spread of the coronavirus, filming would stop immediately and everyone was to go home. I wasn't prepared for that to happen. Since the pandemic started, TV has had a kind of timelessness. So much was filmed before stay-at-home orders that shows have offered a respite from history. Thus, here I was, blissfully going along watching Drag Race as if the pandemic had somehow not affected it, enjoying the hours of laughs and fashion and dead drops as I always did. I felt secure in the idea that the production had concluded before lockdown in the UK, and that I was allowed this little window into normal. So, when RuPaul made the announcement, I found myself, for lack of a better word, triggered. Inside of a little window of normal, here was a sudden, swift reminder of when it all began. I recently gave a plenary in Moscow, and I opened by remembering the start of the pandemic. Sitting at my dining room table with my husband, the news came across the New York Times app on my phone. People were getting sick. This new virus appeared extremely contagious, and it had arrived on the scene in China just when people were taking a holiday, traveling to all parts of Asia and also to the United States. Living in Portland, I knew that Seattle, just 3 hours north of me, would be a hub for that travel, that this new virus would make its way quickly all the way through America. I looked at my husband. This is going to come here. Everything is going to change. That was January 2020. The states didn't really start locking down to the extent that we did until March, when, as suddenly as an announcement from RuPaul, schools closed, students went home, teachers looked to confused administrators for support and guidance, and learning went entirely quiet for a few days, for a week, before sputtering and lurching back again. Now, I've been doing work in digital learning for 2 decades, mostly on the fringe of education, but suddenly my expertise became the expertise, and the calls came raining in. From NPR, The Guardian, The Economist, the Associated Press. Groups at my own institution and others as far away as South Africa asked me to come to speak with them, because this is what I have been doing. This is my expertise. But I'm not an expert. I was also unprepared. Not in the way of knowing how to use a learning management system or how to conduct a successful call on Zoom. I've been working online for working online more than on ground for 20 years. So going remote really didn't change anything for me. But that wasn't the problem, was it? The problem wasn't the technology. The real challenge wasn't learning apps or software or code. The real challenge was staying connected, genuinely connected, remembering that someone else was out there on the other end of the email or text message, the other side of the screen. Teachers didn't want to lose touch with their students or their colleagues or their friends and family. But the harsh glare of the LCD screen is no warmth decent enough to replace a held hand, the echo of laughter in a room down the hall, a smile in full relief. We all longed for something we never knew we had been taking for granted, a too crowded room, the polite bless you following a stranger's sneeze, maskless faces, the hint of mint on someone's breath. How could I, an expert in digital pedagogy, be an expert in this challenge? The answer was that I couldn't be. I couldn't tell a soul that doing this thing or that thing would work well in Zoom, or that yes, there are surefire ways of making asynchronous discussion work. Because as relevant as those are to the questions digital pedagogy pursues, they were not the most relevant in March or April or May last year, and I don't think that they are today. Online learning has never been what teachers and students had hoped it would be. The default approach to online education, which has made institutions like Southern New Hampshire University, University of Arizona, and Western Governors University so financially successful, has been aimed at a replicability, at a sameness of instruction and outcomes that was never the goal of classroom learning. Consistency, says Ralph Waldo Emerson, is the hobgoblin of little minds. Yet consistency has been the goal of learning design theory since the early days. Consistency of instructional methods, consistency of rubrics, consistency of assessment, consistency of outcomes, all with the idea that learning not only could be proven by such methods, but that it must be. And our learning technologies have gone a long way in supporting that consistency, that sameness. And when learning went online in 2020, more educators and students than not were treated to the listlessness of this approach. In response to a need for more and new kinds of human contact, the traditional approach to online learning offered the sterile environment of the LMS, the cordiality of assessments aligned with outcomes, the polite de rigueur of a post once, reply twice conversation. When they were pointed to technology as a solution to the multitude of dilemmas created by the pandemic, teachers and students didn't find the help their hearts needed. So I became a peddler in hope and compassion. I stood at the virtual corner on my soapbox, waving my copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed and saying to anyone who would listen, teach through the screen, not to the screen. Screw technology, find each other. In teaching through the screen and the necessity of imagination literacy, I wrote, teachers can no longer control the seating arrangement of a dispersed classroom, nor can they expect that everyone will leave their children, their dogs, their spouses at the classroom door. Likewise, the sounds of traffic outside the window or the construction going on down the street. Nor can they leave at the door their worries about feeding their family, nor their hopes that their company won't close, leaving them unemployed. These all enter into the new classroom, for the new classroom is ever also the home and all it contains. To really understand how to teach or work online, we have to remember that every learner is human, and there are no humans existing in digital space. The screen is not a venue, it's a tool. We don't ever teach to a screen, we always teach through the screen. These were a few very long months. Keynotes, workshops, plenaries, podcasts, and in the midst, like so many, I was taking care of my family, supporting my husband and my kid through their college graduations that now could only be virtual, and taking my deeply beloved academic conference that feels like a summer camp, Digital Pedagogy Lab, off campus and putting it online. I didn't know how to do that, to transfer an event that depended on accidental conversations and synchronicities, unexpected collaborations, and authentic emotion onto a so flat screen. I said to everyone, we're going to make mistakes because no one knows what they're doing. And I said this to myself because I didn't know what I was doing and I was going to make mistakes, and because I was terrified too. One of the biggest struggles we have when we find ourselves in crisis is tightening up, bracing for impact. My family stocked up a month's worth of food and toilet paper and just in case rubbing alcohol and hand sanitizer. My housemate learned to make masks and turned out 2 or 3 dozen for the family to use. We didn't know what to expect, and so we hoarded those things that we most feared running out of. The same thing happens with educators. Only we tend to hoard things like grades and academic integrity. Instructional designers hoard that consistency of design across courses. Administrators hoard the stuff of seat time, attendance, and keeping class schedules running. We all worry that our most precious resource, students, will slip through our fingers if we aren't prepared for the worst. So we batten the hatches and we tighten the knots in anticipation of the storm. I've never really heard anyone argue for a one-size-fits-all approach to learning. Not really, even though that hobgoblin certainly informs a lot of educational theory, especially behaviorist theory. But more people than not tout ideas like personalized learning, problem-based learning, and teaching approaches that make room for difference. But in an emergency, and widespread across the emergencies of 2020, one-size-fits-all became the mode of the day. Streamline everything, make it simple, keep it regular. Even deeply affective approaches like trauma-informed pedagogy reinforced ideas of consistency and reliability. And so many of us nodded our heads in agreement and signed on the dotted line. Now, I'm not pointing fingers, unless I'm pointing also at myself. I felt all of this too. In redesigning Digital Pedagogy Lab as an online event, I found myself looking for ways to replicate online what I accomplished on ground. something I knew better than to try to do, and which I have proclaimed over and over again shouldn't be attempted and can't be done. In coaching others to deal with the pivot, I wanted so badly to provide a rigorous solution that would work in any circumstance. And I watched other educators provide those solutions in the way of best practices for Zoom and strict timelines to keep learning on track. I watched institutions adopt software to ensure that testing could continue as usual, particularly remote proctoring services. But there was no as usual. And when there is no as usual, we have two choices: hoard our resources, or read our world and fess up to what really needs to be done. Many have supposed that out of this crisis might grow a new educational approach or institution, one that might support faculty and staff to advance educational equity and move away from the all too common one-size-fits-all approach of online learning. That kind of utopia is definitely my cup of tea, but it doesn't happen without a capacity and willingness to rethink what we've always done and imagine things as they might be otherwise. Transformation isn't serene or delightful, nor is it a survival mechanism. Transformation is a reasoned response to a reality that no longer serves our needs. My educational philosophy is grounded in critical pedagogy and the work of people like Paulo Freire and bell hooks. For Freire, the goal of pedagogy is the maturation of a critical consciousness, that capacity and willingness to inspect even our most foundational assumptions about learning and education, to be honest about them, and to change what needs to be changed. What that means is that critical pedagogy methodologies are often marked by the discomfort they create. Because critical pedagogy aims to deeply question our epistemological assumptions about teaching, about education, about power, about expertise. And while this can be exhilarating, it is almost never a picnic. In fact, that's kind of the rubric for critical pedagogy, if there is one, that it isn't easy. In Teaching to Transgress, bell hooks writes that often when university students and professors read Freire, they approach his work from a voyeuristic standpoint. Many times people will say to me that I seem to be suggesting that it is enough for individuals to change what they think. And you see, even their use of that enough tells us something about the attitude they bring to the question. I take her meaning here as a forthright reminder that critical pedagogy is never a halfway endeavor. The development of critical consciousness in ourselves and others is pretty much as unrelenting as it is important. Critical pedagogy reveals, and it is precisely that revealing that can be so uncomfortable, because even a teacher's methods are not above examination. In the past year, too many people have expressed sentiments like those of Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's former chief of staff, when he said, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." And I think it would be wrong to see a pandemic as an opportunity, or the halting and lurching and stalling of our educational system something that shouldn't go to waste. Likewise, I don't see the kind of hefty questioning that critical pedagogy calls for an opportunity as much as it is a responsibility. And let's be honest, most of us didn't want additional responsibility added to our work when all we really wanted was normal again, and we still just want normal. That makes it hard to imagine that out of this crisis might grow a new educational approach, a new kind of institution, a constructive change motivated by this crisis. And I'm an optimist, don't get me wrong. I have been involved in a movement for critical digital pedagogy for nearly 2 decades and have relished every small shift I've witnessed. But I also think that lasting change comes from small, intentional, critical steps, decisions that we make that we won't unmake. And certainly the pandemic has inspired this kind of work across the digital pedagogy community. Take, for example, Maha Bali, Autumn Keynes, and Mia Zamora, faculty developers and designers who launched Equity Unbound to provide clear practices for educators to approach online learning in equitable ways. Shay Swager, a librarian at CU Denver, who wrote a critique of remote proctoring services that use facial recognition software and started a movement on campus to ban such services. Robin DeRosa and Martha Burtis, collaborators at Plymouth State University, who developed the ACE framework for hybrid teaching that puts adaptability, connection, and equity first. And Jesse Stommel, whose work on ungrading and new assessment has opened up that conversation in spaces that didn't exist before. These and many other folks have taken on the pandemic with imagination, care, persistence, and a fortitude that are the hallmarks of lasting change. But, and here's my optimism sneaking through, none of these educators is unique, except in their capacity and willingness to think again about how education should happen when our circumstances radically change. They have responded to their own uncertainty not by hoarding, but by sharing, not by trying to continue business as usual, but by imagining things as they might be otherwise. We may want to respond to the pandemic, to the pivot online, by waiting it out, by filling in the gaps, by making do. But we must respond by taking a close look at what has happened, revising our approaches to education, even our epistemological beliefs, and letting a generosity of imagination be our modus operandi. And how is that responding and revising done? Well, if I have any expert advice to offer, it would be this. Change the way you teach. Ask, what do you want to know about learners from the very start of your relationship? What should they know about you? What barriers might exist that will inhibit your connection to students and from student to student? Develop a digital literacy that's an interpersonal one. Always ask, who is not in the room who could be? Allow time in synchronous meetings and collaborations for connecting and relationship building. Find back channel and ungraded spaces for communication, like virtual office or coffee hours. Perhaps most importantly, though, develop empathy for one another in virtual or digitally inflected spaces. But at the same time, don't assume you understand the challenges students face. Empathy is best developed by listening. Imagine your own digital pedagogy. Ask yourself, what counts as digital? What is your overall pedagogical approach, and how does that translate or not translate to digital environments? What is the most important part of your pedagogy that you don't want to lose when you teach online? The truth is that education didn't need COVID-19 to make it necessary to ask these kinds of questions. As educators, we are all always already called to develop a critical consciousness about our work. But the pandemic has brought into greater focus that our assumptions about what's been happening in classrooms and behind the scenes and online in education are less informed than we would like to believe. We don't get to watch the screen and act like normal, because at every turn, there's a drag queen superstar waiting to remind us that things are not normal. And in order for any normal to return, we have to invent it to ourselves. Thanks.
Sean, thank you so very much for starting off our reflection here this afternoon. It's powerful, responding to uncertainty through imagination, creativity, compassion, responding to and connecting with the person that is the learner, the person that is the facilitator of learning. Other ideas that were emerging for me were really separating online learning and digital pedagogy from teaching and learning during a crisis, during a pandemic. And I think we all crossed that bridge a little bit. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to open the floor to questions, to remarks, to perhaps some short shared stories or experiences by our participants. So I invite you all to ask a question in the chat or unmute and pose a question here or a thought, perhaps to initiate a little discussion here as part of these themes. You can raise your hand in the functions of Zoom or go from there. I see Ruth. Please unmute and pose your question or share your thought.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Sean. That was a great presentation. I really loved the fact that you're bringing empathy into the equation here. because we've had over the past year a ton of advice about how to do this and that and how to do breakout rooms on Zoom and all that sort of thing. But I slightly disagree with your observation that it's not an opportunity, because I found it a huge opportunity to do exactly what you're talking about and rethink the whole way I teach creatively and not listen to the best practices that were thrown at us the whole time. And it was not that easy to do because I have really large classes to teach essay writing. So in the winter when it hit, had 140 students or so, and we had to just get through the term as best we could. But then in the fall, I had 210 students. And so I knew straight away the one thing I did not want was to lecture on Zoom to everyone at once. I thought that was going to be the worst thing, like the worst idea ever. And so although the numbers don't really support doing this, what I did right away is break this class down into groups of 7 or 8 and meet with them for shorter times in little groups and sort of launch those as study groups as well. Because with the TA hours I had, we couldn't meet every week. So I would say, well, this week we have a discussion, next week you have a study group. And so by ignoring all that expert advice, I tried to make my own way, and I think it worked well, but I can't believe that people are still lecturing to whole classes on Zoom and recording that and so on. So your thoughts?
Well, bless you for not lecturing to all of those people. That really, well, and here's part of the reason why that has continued to happen is because that actually is one of the ways that people have traditionally transferred what happens in a classroom into an online space. More often than not, people who are trained in online learning or who are advised by instructional designers will actually be told, well, record your lecture, put it in the LMS, and you're good to go. I had a colleague once who was a really wonderful in-classroom teacher who then got the challenge of teaching online. And he said, well, this is fine. You know, I just put my slides online and it basically teaches itself. And I was like, wait a minute, how can you forget you're teaching? And when you go into that space, like it should be there with you. And so it sounds like you've done that, and that's really wonderful. But what I'm also hearing is that you really innovated your pedagogy. You said, well, what I don't want to do is this, and what I do want to make sure I maintain is this. And see, for me, that yes, there is a kind of opportunity that arises out of that. But again, for me, it's more sort of our responsibility as educators to engage whatever forum we happen to be in a pedagogical method. So whether or not there was COVID-19 going on or there was a crisis going on, anytime that we move into a new form, especially an online form, we have that kind of responsibility to say, well, what's my pedagogy? What's really important to me? And then take that into online space, rather than trying to take, I lecture here or I do group work here, and so I'm going to lecture here or do group work here. It's sort of, you have to change media. I was talking to a colleague the other day about this sort of difference, and she brought up the difference between the movie and the book. That we read the book and then we go see the movie and we're like, the movie wasn't any good, or oh, I love the movie and I don't like the book. But the truth is, the two of them do different things. A book can do something movies cannot do. Movies can do something a book cannot do. So when we move into an online space, we should be thinking about, what can this do that on ground can't do? And vice versa. What can I do on ground that I cannot do online? Because they're both valuable media. So yeah, I mean, I think that what you're talking about is fantastic, and it's exactly that kind of thinking and that kind of care around pedagogy that is the sort of thing that needs to be done. The whole best practices stuff, like, it's really designed to be applicable across any situation, and that just doesn't work. We have different populations of students. You may have one class that works differently than another class, so you really can't. That just doesn't work. So I applaud what you've done. I think that's just fantastic.
Thanks, Sean. You mentioned in a roundabout way pedagogies of care, and this is a theme that has kind of come out today in a few sessions. means different things, I think, in different contexts. We heard about it in an Indigenous context with resources that support that, mental health in large part. So if at a moment you can speak to that, perhaps in your work in connecting with people, in terms of pedagogies of care and maybe some theoretical underpinnings there, that might be helpful as well. And I also see a few questions coming up that we can follow up with after, if you have any remarks about that notion.
Sure. I mean, I think the idea of pedagogies of care is very, very broad. And I also think that it's become like trauma-informed pedagogy. It's become something that has fallen into the spotlight over this past year during COVID. It from my perspective, it should have always been there. And for a lot of folks, it always was there. Because you have students, before COVID, you have students who are food insecure, housing insecure, who experience racial inequities, and they're all in your classroom. So to not teach from a pedagogy of care in that situation is to eliminate those folks, to not include them in what's happening. Really only the people who benefit from not having trauma. Raise your hand if you don't have trauma. We all do now, you know, thank you, COVID. But to teach to just people who are just fine and their situation is stable, you miss teaching lots of people. You also miss, and this is the other side of pedagogies of care to me, you miss the opportunity to change your teaching and to be informed by students who have stories that you may not be hearing otherwise. So to me, it's very much about story. I'm a narrative guy. I write, but it's really very much about story, which is why I said, you know, empathy is best developed by listening, because I really think that we need to be able to not just assume we know what people are going through, but to say, what are you going through? And then listen. Yeah. So I do think that, I mean, the idea of a pedagogy of care is really, really, really important. It's also really broad, and there's so many different ways that we can approach it. But I think that just remembering that students are human beings is a good first step.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move. I see a hand up, Dr. Adekrouri. Maybe you can unmute if you like and pose your question.
Sure, thank you very much, and apology again for not having a camera. I'm not a camera fan, so it is a comment that I had to share. It's a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for, I would add, assurance. You assured me personally that, you know, it is okay to change styles. It's okay to dare to use different tools in online learning. And I would have to really repeat what you just said, the imagination. I think this is what adds into the pandemic, the COVID-19, that every professor has you know, it has imagined his or her course in a specific way. And that is definitely a critical perspective that has added to me personally. And one of the things as well is the opportunities. And I think having a culture of sharing, this is something new. And I know everyone is, you know, attending workshops here and there, and sometimes you can, you know, get or read a book or so. But to have now a culture of sharing pedagogical tools and lessons and stories and what has worked with me, and ask my colleagues, and this kind of forums that we are attending at TLSS, they are doing an amazing job of having, you know, expertise of what worked in some places and sharing stories. So I think this is all add to the imagination of education at a university level. Sometimes I feel bad for myself. I'm not you know, an elementary school teachers, because sometimes they are, you know, using Play-Doh and other stuff. But now I'm happy at least that I can, you know, use different forms of tools and formative activity online to make it fun. And I always joke with my students, what is the purpose of recording me of 3 hours lecture? Let go watch Netflix movie. That would be more entertaining. But instead to imagine the content in my field of expertise or course content in a more interactive way, that is imagination. So thank you for sharing that piece. It's much, much, much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks for saying so, and I'm glad that spoke to you. I do want to say one quick thing about imagination. For me, there's a difference between imagination and play, and I think that play is really important in learning too. And I myself am a lot less playful a person than I would like to be, so I don't actually incorporate a lot of play into my pedagogy. I'd like to, but I'm just too buttoned up for that. So, but imagination to me is I talk about imagination as a perceptual function. That it's something. It's like all of your empirical senses, right? Your touch and your sight and your taste and smell and all those things. That, but it's something that's slightly different from that. It perceives something that you can't perceive as exists currently. So you have to be able to perceive what might happen, as things might be otherwise, as Maxine Greene is really fond of saying. And I'm actually going to use this as a launching point to talk about one of the questions that's in the chat, if that's cool, because one of the questions in the chat is something that I don't have an answer for, and that is how do you do all of this in a chemistry class with 2,800 students virtually, and it's a lab class. And the answer is, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not a chemistry teacher. I've never even taken a lab class. So I can't honestly have an answer for that. Now, what I can say though, is that someone somewhere along the line imagined lab classes. Someone somewhere along the line said, you know, what would be really good is if we had students do lab classes. That had never been done before, right? Somewhere along the line that had never been done before. They invented that. Now's a good time for inventing. There's always a good time for inventing. And trying to figure out something new requires sort of recognizing that what we assume is normal is just what's been handed to us. But we can actually take that and look and go, okay, well, what's the real point behind that? What's really trying to accomplish? What's really trying what are we trying to have happen? And then think through, is there another way to accomplish that same thing? And this is where that replicability piece, that's sort of like, I can take what's on ground and put it online, doesn't work, because you can do on-ground labs. It's very difficult to do them online. It's very difficult to do a 180 people writing essays in an online class. I've done it, like I've tried. It's really hard. It takes a lot of time and a lot of labor. But you have to find ways. There are different ways, and if we can break free of our traditional thinking and the way that we think education has to happen, we might be able to sort of move in that direction. Part of the thing I would also say is that if you're teaching a class of 2,800 people in an online situation, you should probably be going to the institution and saying, this can't happen, by the way, so we need to change the way this works. There should never be a class of 2,800 people online, unless it's a MOOC. So maybe you make a chemistry MOOC, I don't know. But my point being that this sort of imagination is actually a really, really important piece of it. And the imagination is looking at what we have, what we've been handed, and recognizing that's a construct that was built at some point, so we can build something else.
Sean, Michael, can I ask a question? So yeah, you open up a Pandora box, and there's so much here to think about. One of the things that came right away as soon as we were told we had to teach online is colleagues said, oh, but this is an opportunity to empower the students to be responsible for their learning. We give them things to read, and then we come back and we meet. And but what they have lost in going online is the pep talk, the group motivator of these meetings together, connecting with their neighbors and their peers, and then leaving the room with a bit of energy or enthusiasm to go and explore further. Now we're telling them they're responsible for this on their own, in front of their screen, with thousands of pages of documents that they're supposed to go through, or hours and hours of videos they have to manage themselves. And you mentioned the question of empathy, and this is one important thing that said, tell students, don't hesitate to communicate, to email me, to tell me stuff and ask questions, because it's precisely what they're missing. They're missing this group motivator that, and so, as you say, we need imagination to replace it. But I think that's the thing I'm struggling with, is how to replace that. Because the courses, we all know that courses which are big shows are not necessarily the best courses, because students don't necessarily learn. They come in and they have a big time and then they leave and they don't learn anything. But within a course, you can do a lot of interactive and stimulating things. But still, there is something that is very hard to replace.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we're feeling it right now. Right now. If I was in front of you in a room, the dynamic would be completely different. For me, for you, everything would be different. You could see my legs, for starters. There's that social piece is really, really important. And trying to replace that in an online space, you can't. I'll just say, you can't. What you can do is create a new kind of social in online space. Spaces where students can interact with each other in ungraded ways and in spontaneous ways.
Yeah, we do that. They have their own networks and their own chat rooms, and
that's great
with the classes.
That's great.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I do want to address too that you said is that the idea of this being the opportunity to give students more responsibility maybe isn't in line with pedagogies of care or trauma-informed pedagogy, because so many folks, when this happened, I don't know about Canada, but in the States, we had students who were suddenly not on campus anymore. That meant they lost their job, they lost their housing, they had to find a way to make it. The idea of saying, okay, now you're responsible for your own learning is like, what? And I have to find a job, and I have to find food, and I have to find shelter. This was a very real thing that happened last March and April and May. This was happening all over the States.
But even beyond that, I mean, we quickly realized it doesn't work. Professors who tried to add more teaching, you read the next chapter, they quickly realized within a few weeks that it didn't work. Faculty was bombarded with emails of desperate students. We can't cope with the amount that's being put on our back.
Yep.
It's they think that because we're online, we have time. But they say we don't have more time. Actually, we have less time because we're always online.
That's right. That's right. I had colleagues, distant colleagues, people I'm not necessarily close with, who said, this is a great time to do your writing, to do your dissertation, or not dissertation, but write that book you've always wanted to write. And I'm like, no, it really isn't. This is a time to make sure you have food and to make sure that you can keep up with the things that you need to keep up with. Some people found that freedom. Some people were able to do that. That was not my situation. None of my students found themselves in that situation. Some of what you're describing is something that's been done for a really long time, and that's flipped learning, right? And I'm not actually really fond of the whole idea of flipped learning, specifically because it kind of has a trademark quality to it, like flipped learning, plug and play, here you go. There's best practice associated with it. But the idea behind flipped learning is that you let them do that work on their own. Then you come in and you have this wonderful social environment where they all collaborate and they learn together, and you have that kind of enthusiasm that you're talking about. To try to say that we can do that when the entire thing is going to be online is really false. So in that case, what really needed to happen was, well, and this is, I mean, I'll be honest, I've been talking about this for almost a year. And I'm getting a little like, I start to sound to myself like a broken record, not to you all, but to me like a broken record. Because essentially what really needed to happen was for people to slow down and say, what do you need to students? What can you handle? And to be able to answer that question themselves. This is what I need. This is what I can handle. No one wasn't, like I said a second ago, no one wasn't experiencing trauma during that time. Everyone was. So this was an opportunity. If there was an opportunity, it was a chance to talk to each other and to reconnect as people around the idea of education. Not a chance to say, let's keep up with the homework, let's keep up with the tests, let's give students more responsibility. That wasn't the opportunity that was ahead of us. What was the responsibility laid before us was figure out how to do this as human beings together, because no one wants to do this online this way. And so I really try to encourage people just to have lots of conversation and to begin that conversation and keep that conversation going, so that when the pandemic ends, we have new knowledge about what learning means and what education, how education works.
Thanks, Sean. You know, you've touched on a few themes that I think have come up in the chat. Before we turn back to the chat, I see Diane Riddell has had her hand up for a little while. Dan, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, thank you for a brilliant chat that really made me think anyway. And I'm actually trying an experiment next week with my class. I worked for a long time and I'm just new to teaching. And I have a midterm next week that I'm administering within a 24-hour period. So I'm letting people write it anytime they can, because I have students anywhere around the world, everywhere around the world. And you know, some people have asked me, are you worried about them cheating or whatever? And I guess your talk made me think about the fact that maybe we need to be less worried about that. Because if it turns out that for part of the midterm, students do collaborate a little bit to answer a question or whatever, they're still learning. And at the end of the day, that's been accomplished, and there are places in the midterm for them to communicate personally what they've learned as well. So my thought from your talk is about maybe some of the stuff we were doing before wasn't bad for the environment we have now, but we have to think in terms of how do we make it work in the environment that we have with students. And that's why I'm trying this 24-hour thing, and I'm not so worried about the cheating part, at the risk of other people stoning me for saying that.
Well, I will agree with you, so they'll stone me. I think that, and this is actually really interesting. So the couple points that you made that I want to address, and I'll address the last one first. One of the things that's happened, so in the States, we're test crazy. We love testing people to see where they're at or measure progress, basically so that schools can get funding. One of the things that happened over the pandemic was those sorts of standardized tests, those big, wide standardized tests, got suspended. Elementary school students weren't taking their tests because they couldn't be in class and there was no way to safely proctor, blah, blah, blah. Same thing happened with like the ACT and the SAT. These entrance exams basically into college were suddenly suspended, and more institutions decided, you know what, we don't need these actually. So they started just not using them anymore. What we found was these aren't necessary to learning. Now, what may happen when we get past this pandemic is a rubber band effect, where all of a sudden, boom, we're back and we're doing testing again. But what also may happen at the other side of it is we may have more people advocating for, you know what, we found out that wasn't necessary, so let's not keep doing it. And the same thing is true with grading, with the idea of cheating. We're being shown a world where these things have to be brought into question. We are in this situation where we can't teach the way that we think we can teach without really applying a lot more rigor and really subjecting students to a lot more failure than they would have been had we'd all been able to stay in class. So I think it's really important to recognize that some of these things that we take for granted, that we've always believed were part of education, now have maybe shifted a little bit because we've had to shift them. Why would we shift them back? Is there momentum here that we can build towards some new way of doing education, something that's more equitable, fairer, that focuses more on what students are actually learning? So that, I think, I applaud you. That's fantastic. That you're headed the right direction. And yes, everyone can throw vegetables at me. They won't hit me because I'm way over here. But the other thing that I wanted to say, speaking of way over here, is that when I did Digital Pedagogy Lab last year, I had a recognition that I was going to have attendees from across 20 time zones, all trying to attend during a 1-week period, this very intensive sort of pedagogical event. To do that, I had to promise them that everything would be asynchronous, that there would be nothing that they had to show up for at a specific time, because I couldn't say, well, it's going to be at noon in New York, and I'm sorry if you're in Australia, good luck. I couldn't do that. It had to be equitable. And the way it was made equitable was by making it as asynchronous as possible. But I played with this idea of what I call synchronish. And that is that we're all learning together along the same timeline, just at different moments. So it is synchronous. It's synchronous where you're at. It's not synchronous where I'm at, but it's synchronous where you're at. And so we're all kind of experiencing a similar thing. And what ended up happening was people didn't feel this weird boundary to participation because they didn't have to worry about their time zone. They could participate when they had to. They jumped into asynchronous conversation, and they had an amazing time over a course of a week. And that's the kind of like recognizing that there isn't something evil about asynchronous, that there's actually something really cool that can be done that way. It provides more access, provides more opportunity for people. Taking a midterm and extending it over 24 hours. I've heard people extending the midterm over a course of a week. It's like, here, you have this week, and you just finish it whenever you finish it. Do it when you can. And they still do it, and they still learn, and they still accomplish, and it's fine. So that kind of relaxing of the sort of rules that we're accustomed to is that imaginative solution making, I think.
Speaking of imagination, Jill suggests, as you have inspired us to do, to teach through the screen, that we can throw vegetables at you through the screen instead of throwing them at the screen, of course. You know, stemming from your idea here of synchronish, you know, a few of the comments in the chat were, you know, about activities or suggestions for alternative pedagogies. You've kind of woven us through a few of your own thoughts in your own practice, in your own contexts, you know, with this positive outlook to asynchronousness, if you will. What are other things that that your imagination has helped you construct in your own pedagogical contexts? What other sort of alternatives have you come up with that have worked for you?
So a lot of, for me, imagination comes in when we do a critical exercise of really examining what our assumptions are. For example, when I was a grad student teaching creative writing at University of Colorado Boulder, I was given a syllabus, and the syllabus, and I don't know if anyone in here does writing or creative writing, but they had instrumentalized creative writing. Basically, so you're going to learn how to do plot, you're going to learn how to do character, you're going to do setting, you're going to do time, you're going to do all these sorts of things. It's basically these component parts, and if you learn how to do each of the component parts in the right portion, you'll write a book, and you're done, and you're good. I don't believe in that, and I've never, because I grew up writing and I never learned those things. So I told students, I looked at that and I said, well, what's really the point of doing a creative writing class? And when I came to it, it was like, well, to learn to be a writer, and to learn to be a writer, you have to think like a writer. So that was the rubric for my class. Spend your entire semester thinking like a writer. And that means all kinds of things for all different kinds of people. But it also, what it helped me do was reimagine assignments. So they did things like an adventure report. They would go out in the world and do something they'd never done before. And they wrote me writer's letters, which were self-assessments, basically, of like, here's where I'm at during the semester, here's how I'm going. And it was a letter like, Dear Sean, and it signed, and then I would respond with a letter. It's very time consuming. But being able to strip away and basically throw that syllabus out and say, it doesn't have to be taught this way, it can be taught this way, suddenly opened up doors to all kinds of different things that could happen. That same idea of sort of thinking like a writer, I was speaking with I think she's biology, someone in STEM, and I was talking to her last week, and she was saying essentially the same thing. Well, when I teach my biology class, I just ask them to think like a biologist. So I don't tell them, here are the facts, learn the facts, tell me back the facts. Instead, I say, well, okay, here's a book, here's what you need to accomplish, here's what a biologist would do. So how are you going to go about doing it? And then they figure out for themselves how they go about doing it. And they accomplish something so much more foundationally important, because they learn something about their capacity to do the thing rather than just the capacity to pass the test. So yeah, I think that kind of, I don't know if that's a good example or not, but it starts with that critical analysis of what am I trying to accomplish and what really is important here, and then getting imaginative from there.
It sounds, to use some potentially parallel language that we hear a lot about at the university, you know, in terms of levels of thinking, you know, in higher order thinking, using, let's say, Bloom's taxonomy, moving away from these declarative forms of knowledge and light elements of understanding to analysis and to evaluation to creation, but via a lens of a writer, via a lens of a biologist. In your sector, you know, how do you equate imagination and creativity and these levels and articulate them in forms of learning outcomes? You know, how does that manifest? Or is that a taboo word, you know, in your circle? How does that work?
It's not a taboo word, but it is one that I don't use for my own pedagogy. How do I say this? So I think that learning outcomes should be observed rather than set. So I think that we watch students as they're learning, and we recognize, oh, this is what they're learning, and that's great. Now, if we're guides, or we understand our fields better than anyone, that's why we're teaching. So students who are in that room with us, if they're learning something over here, and you're like, well, that's great, but that has nothing to do with what we're learning here. It's not our subject. That's your opportunity to pull them back around, have a conversation with them, and bring them back into whatever learning process there is. When I've been pressed and people have said, but I have to have learning outcomes, my response is, okay, well, meet them halfway through the term. Set it so that you meet your learning outcomes halfway through the term, and then see what happens after that. Because then there's all this space for invention and creation, and you have no idea what's going to come from that. So I'm definitely down with the idea that people have structures. The university's like, nope, you got to do this, and that's fine. Find the loophole, find the little window where you can peek through and do something unique, like having learning outcomes met by the middle of the term. No one's going to fuss with you if they meet their learning outcomes and then they do more. No one's going to care. So yeah, I mean, trying to be inventive that way, I think. But learning outcomes for me, I never use the term. I actually talk to my students about how we shouldn't talk about learning outcomes, but yeah.
Sure. Well, we have, I see 2 more minutes for our session. Are there any remaining questions? Did somebody have one burning idea statement that they wanted to run by Sean here as part of our formal presentation? We have asked Sean if he's willing to stick around for 15 or so minutes thereafter. He's accepted. Is that right? Did I get that right? I didn't put so, okay. We haven't put him on the spot there. Any other remaining remarks or hands up there? I'm looking at the field of faces here and waiting my requisite 8 seconds, you see, Sean.
Well, if I may intervene, there is a lot of conversation on the chat, Sean, which emerged from actually your comment or your example, you know, think like a writer, for instance. So which, you know, brought a lot of comments about, you know, the way that we have to rethink completely our evaluation. And sometimes a university has policies, you know, like our university, a policy to say that, well, you need to have a final exam and so on. But there is a lot of questioning about that. And yes, we are now, the university, also questioning that policy, so that the evaluation is not seen anymore as a test or an exam, but the evaluation is really allowing, actually, enabling students to demonstrate such and such skills. So, so thanks for the example that you gave, because I can see that there is a lot of thinking going on the chat. So I just wanted to intervene this way.
Well, listen, before we just wrap up in the remaining moments, maybe Sean, if you had a few final remarks here, and then I'll close the meeting officially and share a few alternative options here for people before session 5, our second last session of the day here. So any final words, Sean?
Sure. I'm not great at concluding remarks, just like I'm not good at learning outcomes or exams. But I'll tell a quick story if I can. So when I was in junior high school, middle school, I was 13 years old, and 13 years old is terrible, right? Just terrible for everybody. I had a really hard time in school. I was basically failing out. I didn't go to class. I spent my days walking around town instead of going to class. And there was a vice principal at the school who noticed what was going on with me. And she brought me into her office, and of course I thought I was in trouble. And instead she said, how can I help you with this learning? How can I help you stay in school? And I told her what my problems were, and she listened. And then she created a completely different situation for me, where she basically said, okay, you're going to go to half days of school, and you can just take these classes that you're really comfortable with. And then I want you to do an independent study with me. And what would you like to do for your independent study? I wrote a novel, 13-year-old novel, but a novel. And she saved my life, basically. I would not be here in front of you if it had not been for that vice principal. I wouldn't have gone to college. I might not have finished high school if it hadn't been for that person. That person who was willing to look at the rules of education and say, if this doesn't save this kid, we don't need these rules. We make new rules because we need to make sure we save this kid. And so what that taught me about education and pedagogy is that that's the driving motivation, is the people, and not the not the institution, not the rubrics, not the sort of tradition that we all come into this with, but the people. And if we can't make those exceptions for those people, then we're
right in the midst of the most powerful part of the conclusion, Sean, it cut.
Oh, no way.
Just the momentum was there. And then the last few words, we lost them. I don't know if you happen to have them still on the tip of your tongue yet.
I was just saying that I think that if we can't save the student, if we can't focus on the person, then we are missing out. We're failing our most important resource. And if we need to shift the way that we do exams, if we need to rethink things, if we need to have conversations with our administrators or the administrators above those administrators, if we need to do that in order to save a single student, then we need to do that. Yeah. I think that's where the pedagogy, for me, that's where pedagogy really is grounded.
Sean, thank you so much for taking us on this adventure, an adventure that has got us to think critically about what we want to do and accomplish as teachers, what our students need as people, and taking us on a personal journey at that, a very powerful one. So please clap here, use your reaction function perhaps in the Zoom tool here.